Welcome back to the College Checklist podcast with March Consulting College Planning and Higher Scores Test Prep, where we make the confusing chaos of the college admissions process simple as it can be. As we enter a new era of testing and admissions, we're bringing you a new guide to application season with a whole new team of experts and guests. So much has changed with the SAT in particular this year and continues to change even now as people react to how the rollout has gone. And so this episode is going to cover everything you need to know about the new digital SAT, and we are here to be your guides. So I am Julia, the test prep expert. I am the director of online programs at Higher Scores Test Prep. I've been teaching the SAT, ACT, PSAT, and AP Lit and Language for almost a decade now. And I develop all the curriculum, and I work one-on-one with our students who are doing self-paced courses. So I am in it. I'm in this new SAT stuff. This has been my life the last 6 months. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christina, and I am an independent educational consultant, which is a very long way of saying I help students and families navigate the college admissions process. Everything from picking the right schools in the first place to preparing the best applications. And a lot of my students are in the STEM specialties, so I work with science, technology, engineering, mathematic-minded students. I have pre-med and pre-law, but I have also worked with film majors and I have worked with English majors, so I have a lot of experience navigating admissions. Before that, I spent over 10 years teaching in our local high school district. I taught math, everything from foundations and algebra all the way up to statistics, freshmen to seniors, and everything in between. I was also a part of the curriculum teams that they would put together over the summer. They'd hand select teachers to work on lessons and tests and curriculum for all of the schools in the district to use. And all along the way, I was also doing subject-specific tutoring, including SAT math, ACT math. So a little bit of the college admissions experience and a lot of the math and testing experience to boot.
Yeah. So we've got everything you need here. So we're going to try and break this new SAT down between the two of us into a few of the biggest components, a few of the biggest new things that people are having a little trouble understanding that's taking a bit of an adjustment period. And we're going to start with either the most exciting or the scariest part, depending on who you are, and that is the adaptive test. What does adaptive mean? How does it work? How does the scoring work? How has it impacted everything? So, to start with the basics, adaptive in this case just means that the test adapts to your skill level and sort of spits out a different version of the test to try and sort of max you out of your skill to help you reach the end of your abilities. So part of how they do that is each question is weighted a bit differently depending on difficulty. It's worth slightly more or less. So then if you are able to, through the combination of the questions that you get right, get to a certain threshold, which we don't quite know what it is because they won't tell us. But if you get to a certain threshold of correct answers of points or value on the first section of each subject, so the first English section or the first math section, then the second part of that subject, you are given an easier or harder version that has adapted to what it learned about your abilities in the first part. So the second part of the English section, you'll either get an easier or harder version. Same thing with math. The second part of the math section, you'll get an easier or harder version. The two subjects do not impact each other. So you could get easy English and hard math, or vice versa. Um, as I said, the goal is to max out your potential. So the students who are getting the harder version, it's because they did well enough on the first section that the test thinks, okay, we can give them harder and harder questions, and they'll be able to get some of them right, and eventually they'll reach the end and it's going to be way too hard. Versus if you didn't do as well on the first section, they want to give you the ability to get as many questions right as possible. That's the idea. Um, in practice, it's a bit messier. Another consequence of this, that in terms of how reactive the test is to you, is that every single student is getting a different set of questions. There's sort of a massive question bank, and each question is given a particular category and a particular difficulty weight. And so every student will get the first combination of question types and difficulties, but they will not get the same set of questions. So it's in theory the same test, but it's not actually exactly the same. We don't know exactly how much these questions are weighted, how much they're worth. We can make guesses. And we know there are 3 tiers. So there's easy, medium, and difficult. We don't know exactly how those tiers are weighted, if it's different per question or if it's just different per tier. But the harder the question is, the more it is worth. For really hard questions, based on estimates of how things have worked on practice tests, the hard questions could potentially amount to up to 20 points of your score, which is pretty wild to think about. So, one lucky guess on a hard question could be the difference between like a 1480 and a 1500. Just one hard question that you picked the right answer on, which could potentially create a lot of differences between the different iterations of your test, um, which is often why we recommend taking it multiple times, unfortunately. And this has also impacted the score reports having such a customizable test. So, Christina, can you tell us a bit about what's different with those?
I can, but before I get into that, I do want to issue a warning for those that have not taken an adaptive test before, because the experience, the feeling of it is very different from the
Mm,
traditional standardized tests as well. Because when you think about the goal of maxing out your understanding, that means at a certain point you're going to be presented questions that you've not been taught, that you don't know how to
mm-hmm,
tackle, which doesn't feel great. Makes you kind of
mm-hmm,
question, am I supposed to know this? Is this my fault?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And the better you do, the harder the questions get. So it may
mm-hmm.
feel like you're not doing very well by the end of it, but that's the
Yeah.
point, because it's trying to identify what questions you're going to miss.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the score report can tell us some things after the fact about the tests that you were given in this adaptive format. It is different from the way they used to provide information, in that they're not going to show you the exact questions you missed. You won't get to go back and see what that question actually was. They will give you sample questions that are similar to what you missed, so that you can get an idea of the concepts that maybe you need to focus more on, but it won't show you what the exact question was, which is a little different. So they'll give you general ideas of the content or the concepts that you were tested on and how you did. They're not going to tell you what the weighting was for those questions. We don't know which ones in particular would have been the make it or break it question in your exam. And in truth, you're not going to know necessarily which version of the test you ended up with. As you mentioned, everybody starts with kind of a similar entry set of questions, not the same questions, but similar difficulty. And from there, the questions might be harder, the questions might be easier. It's not necessarily easy to tell once you're there which of the 2 options you ended up with. It's not easy necessarily to tell after the fact either. So the score reports are not giving us as much information as we used to have, They're not telling us exactly what questions were missed. They're not telling us how much those questions were worth, but it will still give you a lot of good guidance in terms of your continued study and what you might want to focus on.
Yeah. I think some students have complained that the difficulty, so it will give you a similar question of like, you missed this type of question, but the reason that they missed it was because it was so much harder than the example question. So it threw in some new element that they hadn't learned, but like they understand how to do that type of question. But this particular one was like they had never seen before, and now they can't see it again because it's now in the question bank that's going to be used for some other student on some other test somewhere. And so they can't give away the answer. So,
And they're looking at the sample problem going, I could have done that. I
yes,
would have gotten that one right.
exactly. Yeah. So, what do some of these questions look like? How have the sections changed? Um, the English section in particular, it has gotten a full makeover. It is a totally new test. As a teacher of it, it is almost unrecognizable to me. Some of the fundamental sort of mentalities and the kind of ethos of the SAT and how they put together a test is still there, but for it, the experience of taking it is totally different. So fundamentally, first of all, for the English section, there is only one question per passage. So the passages are shorter. They're usually a few sentences up to about 2 paragraphs, so that in theory, there's less reading. However, it is more reading per question. Um, Often, if you get a complete passage, as you work your way through answering the questions, you get a sense of the passage. And so you don't need to go back and read the whole thing every single time you answer a question. You're sort of building an understanding of what the questions are about, what the passage is about, how the questions work together. So you maybe only need to read 2 sentences to find the answer if you know what you're doing. With this, you do have to read the whole thing, sometimes twice, if you're not careful with your annotation. And so some students actually feel like it's more reading per question. So complicated. Another big one, they added poetry. Now, the poetry questions themselves are relatively simple. They're not super in-depth, complicated, because analyzing poetry often takes a whole paper just to like make an argument about what the poet is saying. Like it's a very nuanced and complicated medium with multiple interpretations. So I don't really know why it's in a standardized test.
We have got
Um,
break dancing in the Olympics and poetry on the SAT. What is this world we live in?
what is happening? So, what they sort of their solution is they pick really old poems that require some kind of difficult comprehension, but then ask very simple questions about them. That's how they have sort of resolved that difficulty. The trick isn't in the analysis, it's in the vocabulary comprehension of like how people in the 1800s wrote poems, and they put in a bunch of apostrophes to mush words together so that it would fit the meter and stuff. So you just kind of have to get used to that. They also added synthesis questions. So this is where they give you a bulleted list of information about a particular topic, and they ask you to pick a sentence that summarizes it in some way. There's a couple variations, but it's generally kind of a summary of that information. They've also added best evidence questions. So they provide you with the general topic of a particular text and then a series of quotes from that text. And they ask you to pick the quote that supports or refutes an idea. Um, Again, difficult if you haven't read the text itself. So you have to be very, very literal in how you do your interpretation. And then they've also added, because it's digital and you can't take notes directly on the page, they've added another tool in which you can sort of highlight the text and then type in an annotation that appears when you sort of hover over it. That's going to be very crucial for uh, getting through the whole section alive. So, how has the math changed, Christina?
Sure. I do want to say I love your use of the phrase ethos of the SAT. I would suggest we make that the title of this episode, but I don't know who would click on it. Okay. How is the math section
Might be a
changed?
little too highbrow. We're here for brass tacks. We're here for
Oh
nuts and
boy,
bolts. I just happen to be the hoity-toity English major.
I love it. So obviously the adaptive aspect is new. Obviously
Hmm.
the question weighting is new. That's different. We used to be able to use some of those old school test taking tactics like skip questions at the end that are harder and focus more time at the ones at the beginning because they were all worth the same amount of points.
Hmm.
But now that's very different. And
Hmm.
the truth is, these adaptive aspects kind of limit how high of a score a student can get if they are sent to that easier section on the second half. And you might know better. I think it was around a 650 if you are given that
Hmm.
easier section because of the weighting of the points. It's not mathematically possible for you to really score
Yeah.
too much higher at a certain point.
I
Um,
think we're estimating that the cutoff, like if you do perfectly on the
uh,
easy version, the cutoff is somewhere in the 1400s.
yeah,
We can't pinpoint exactly, but somewhere in there is where the overlap
which means you
stops.
can still get a great score
Hmm.
for a lot of schools. It's just when we're
Yes.
talking top tier looking for that perfect score
Yeah.
is a hindrance.
Hmm.
A nice addition is that you can now use a calculator on both sections. Used to be one you could, the other you could not, but now all calculators all the time. As a matter of fact, they have the Desmos calculator built into the test app. So you can pull that up, which I love as a math teacher who has experience with this particular graphing software because it really allows a lot more flexibility in how you're answering questions. It can save you a lot of time in a lot of situations. The Desmos calculator will graph equations even when they're not in y equals mx plus b form. You can just plug
Hmm.
it in standard form or whatever you're given. So sometimes, depending on the question, it might be a lot faster to use that Desmos calculator. You're going to get fewer questions in this section, which does end up giving you a little bit more time per question than the previous test allowed if you break it down as an average. In terms of the content, though, they're pretty similar still in the subjects that it's going to touch on. They do say you see a little bit more geometry than you used to, perhaps a little more trig, maybe even some proof related geometry stuff. But largely it's still revolving around a heavy emphasis of Algebra 1 and some of those beginning concepts in Algebra 2. So, in truth, in terms of the set of concepts you're going to see, it's actually pretty similar still.
Yeah. I will say, I think the amount of geometry depends on the difficulty
That
of what
makes
you're
sense.
getting. I think geometry is weighted a little more on the hard end of the question spectrum. So the amount that you get might be a little bit different.
Yeah.
And I will also say, sort of anecdotally from students, because of the Desmos calculator helping the really advanced students kind of perfect their math answers, the SAT is having to spit out harder and harder and harder math questions. So if you are getting that hard version of the math test, you might be seeing math that you will never see again. And there, it might get really hard by the end, um, if you are really strong in math. So just sort of a fair warning for everyone. How do you cope with this new platform with all these new questions? This new Blue Book app that's students are going to be spending a lot of time in going forward because it's PSAT, SAT, AP, like you're going to be very, very familiar with this app over time. There's a couple tools on the SAT and PSAT platform specifically that are really, really crucial for helping you track your progress, since you can't physically take notes on the test itself. You can't mark things up. You have to do that digitally. So you want to make sure that you know how to use these tools and that they sort of come naturally to you in the heat of the moment. So um, in terms of progress and pacing and sort of tracking your attention. Um, there is a timer that counts down. I want to emphasize down. So the timer is how much time you have left, not how much time has passed. Okay, that's very important. Don't want to get that mixed up. You can flag a question for review. There's a little pennant symbol next to all the questions. Super important. So you can flag a question and then sort of be reminded to come back to it. I think that is one of the single most helpful tools in this entire new digital system, is that it reminds you to go back. You don't have to do that by yourself. And when it does that, there is a review answers page, which sort of allows you to see how many questions you've answered, how many you've left blank, which ones you've flagged for review, and then you can go directly back to that page. So that shows up when you've gotten through all the questions for the section, or you can access it sort of down at the bottom when it tells you what question you're on. You can sort of click on that and see an overview. There's also there's like a menu that there's a take a break option. If you need to go to the bathroom or something, you just toggle that. And then, as I mentioned, there are annotation tools for the English section now. So you sort of highlight with your cursor, and then you click the highlight and annotate tool, and a little text box will appear, and you can type in your notes. I would also recommend, when you're doing the English section in particular, that you use the answer eliminator. You have to sort of turn it on and then click it for each answer choice. It's not automatically there. You have to like turn on the setting that you would like to use it. Then that allows you to cross off answer choices and then you can uncross them later. But sometimes when you're doing so much reading, it can be hard to sort of help you focus on what reading you should be doing, and it can feel a little overwhelming with all the words on the screen. So if you want to like cross off some answer choices and then just focus on one at a time, that can be very helpful. So what about for the math? What are some tools here?
Yeah, I already revealed my love of the Desmos calculator. Now, for the record, you can still bring your own approved handheld calculator if you prefer. But
Mm-hmm.
that Desmos, man, has so many functions that some of the traditional handheld calculators do not, that can really save you time, like graphing in other forms. It used
Mm-hmm.
to be that if you were dealing with a system of equations and one was in standard form and the other was not, now we're using substitution and we're algebraically plugging one into the other and solving and then plugging that back in. And well, if I can just quickly graph both of those equations exactly the way they're given and find that intersection point, and the calculator will even tell me, oh, here's the coordinates of that point that you're seeing before you.
Mm-hmm.
If I know how to use my technology, that can be so much faster and so much
Mm-hmm.
more accurate in doing so. If you're given a table of points and they're really mean and they just call it a function, find the equation of this function. Well, am I writing a linear equation? Am I writing a quadratic? Am I writing an exponential? And let's say they're very mean and they put the points in a different order than you'd expect. They don't go from smallest to greatest. You really have to analyze that information before you get started to know what form of equation you're looking for. But if you can quickly type those into Desmos, you don't have to reorder them, put them the way they appear, and it shows you the curve and you go, oh, that's an exponential. Or you can see that curve starting to come back down. Oh, that's a quadratic. Now you've got that head start in what form of an equation you're looking for. You can even use it with that table or with a list of values to do some of the statistical calculations, like quickly finding the mean and how it might compare if you made a change to the data set. But all of this is dependent on your understanding of the technology. If you know how to
Mm-hmm.
use it, if you know how to look for that statistics function, if you know how to enter that table. So spend time getting comfortable with it in advance. Um, and while we're getting comfortable, if you're using Blue Book, if you're doing practice tests, you'll see that geometry cheat sheet as well. They've always sort of given us a certain set of equations. And that can be really valuable in terms of knowing what you have to memorize going in. And for some of us who struggle with memorization, it can be really nice to know, okay, I'm going to limit it to these particular concepts because I can always look up those others. Or it's not a bad idea, too, to memorize some of that given information so that you don't have to take the time to pull it up and check. But there's a lot of really great functionality now with the Desmos calculator, as well as the same cheat sheet set of equations to assist you along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's talk about some actual test day reminders that I want to share with you. Like in advance, having charged that device you plan on using, it'd be great if it was
Mm-hmm.
fully charged when you arrived on test day. But just
Mm-hmm.
in case, even if you've done that, make sure to bring the charging aspect as well. If you needed to, plug that in and save yourself at the last minute. You'll be glad that you have that on you when you're in that situation. Make sure you bring everything that they tell you is required on your test pass. You need to have an ID to prove that you're the right person taking that test. And you're going to be using your College Board login when you access Blue Book. So make sure you have all of the items and the information that you need just to get started on the exam as quickly as you can. You want to be careful about any of your electronic devices that may make noise. Now, the truth is that they're not going to put up with phones being nearby anyway, but students will sometimes forget that their watch might have some pre-programmed alarms, or worse, they're borrowing somebody's watch. Just like if you're borrowing someone's calculator, you want to get comfortable with it and know how to use it. We have had families call and leave voicemails over the weekend after their student was unceremoniously excused, having finished the test already, because their watch went off and made a noise, and the proctor was sticking to those rules and said, "I'm sorry, you've been disqualified," after they completed the whole thing. So don't let that
Mm-hmm.
happen to you. Make sure that you're not going to have any disruptions, especially sound wise, and follow all the directions along the way. The last thing I want to remind you of, and this is something that high schoolers, teenagers especially tend to forget, um, is that humans are just complicated houseplants, right? We
Mm-hmm.
need that water, we need our
Uh-huh.
nutrients, we
Yeah.
need sleep. You may not think you do, but I promise you, when it comes to what's happening in your brain, especially during those hours of sleep, you're going to need a full night's rest before the
Mm-hmm.
exam. It is awesome if you can do some movement before you are sitting down to take that test, going for a 20-minute
Put the
walk,
clips on.
because that aerobic activity does release certain chemicals in your brain that have been compared to fertilizer for thought. So that's going
Mm-hmm.
to help you be more focused and make the connections that you need to. Um, Make sure that you get there early enough that you can figure everything out and not be in a state of panic as you're beginning the test. Make sure to eat a reasonable breakfast. A giant sugary Starbucks frappe something is not a reasonable breakfast. That sugar will make you crash mid test, so aim for protein and fibers. Bring a snack for the break. There, you might squeeze in a little sugar because maybe that sugar boost will help you through the second half of the test. Bring a sweater no matter what the temperature outside may be, because sometimes when it's very hot, schools are running that AC and it is Arctic temperatures for the test takers.
Women's winter,
Yes,
as they say.
exactly. Honestly, it's 107 today where I live, and I have a sweater with me all the time. And use those breaks that you're offered. Use them to get up and move and help your circulation and take a quick brain break, because that often will give you those little reliefs that you need to go through a marathon like test, like these tests can be.
Mm. I would also add, particularly if you're using an Apple device of some kind to take the test, but for anyone really, try logging into the Blue Book app the night before and make sure there aren't any updates that have been rolled out. For the very first like national iteration of the test, they pushed out an update the night before,
Yes.
and so some students showed up. And if you're using an Apple device, you have to give the App Store permission to do that update. And so you might need a login for that as well. So it's best if you double check that there aren't any updates the night before and run them. And then if you're using an Apple device, maybe have that App Store login available as well, written down on paper, because you don't want to have to be on the phone with a parent or customer service or both, like when you're supposed to be taking your test, because you can't log in and you have to reset your password. And like, yeah, so have everything written down
You don't want to
beforehand.
waste all of your problem solving brain power on just getting started.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
um
Um,
so a few more logistics.
yeah.
As professionals, what is the process for registering? What are our recommendations for uh registering and like choosing a device to use?
Yes. So when it comes to registering, my advice is do it early, do it often, because as we've mentioned in previous episodes, there's really high demand for tests, especially at certain times of year, to the
Mm-hmm.
extent that some students are missing out on the chance to take it at all. All of the nearby high schools are closed out, even within 200 miles. Some of my students end up driving several hours on test day to take it, and even still, some students can't find nearby availability. So, as soon as you know what your plan is for when you're going to take it, I would recommend that you secure that spot. The sooner, the better. Especially if you're going to be using accommodations to take the test. There is a very particular process for arranging for those that takes a lot of time. So you can't, in the same month, go, you know what, I think I'm going to take the SAT in 2 weeks with accommodations, because it has to be arranged, and that is a process that involves multiple organizations coordinating and communicating. So that can take a while. We do recommend students attempt the test more than once. That first experience often better informs you for how you want to prepare going forward for a follow-up attempt. So it's not a bad idea to register for both that you're planning on if you know that you're going to be taking it, maybe back to back. And uh, as we've mentioned too, it really does work best for students when they're taking the test through their own high school. Traditionally, the SAT has been something that you can sign up for on the Saturdays that it's being offered at any location. Go to a different high school, go to a different city, I just said. However, because of the digital aspect, it is becoming a lot easier for students to just arrange this through their own high school's offerings. And that does come down to the use of their device. So let's talk about choosing the device you're going to use. You do have options according to the College Board. They, on their website, say that you can run Blue Book on a Windows laptop or tablet, on a Mac laptop or iPad, or even a school managed Chromebook. The problem is when students bring their own personal laptop and then have to connect to the internet to run this test app, test software. Schools didn't initially really think about the difficulty there, When it's their own students, the students have signed an agreement for how they're going to use the internet that the school is giving them access to. And the school can limit what they do when they're on the school's internet service. They have an arrangement to make it easy for students to hop on to their wireless networks and such. But they don't want just anybody doing that. So there's a lot of security based regulation on who has access, and that can cause a whole problem. But if it's your school's Chromebook and they've already got Blue Book downloaded on that and you already have access to the school's internet service, then that eliminates a lot of the difficulty of just getting your device set up and functioning. Check with your school as soon as you have the opportunity in the school year. See what their plan is, because I bet you they have a site-wide plan that they've already organized that will already say, we're going to have you using our Chromebooks or otherwise. But you do have options, and some may just be a lot more convenient than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can technically request College Board loan you a device, but you can't request it until after you've already paid and registered, and there is no guarantee that they will provide it. And so their recommendation is to borrow one from a friend. And I find that so wildly unhelpful. Go with what is most convenient for you. And in some cases, that might mean taking the ACT because there's no devices involved, there's no Wi-Fi involved. You just sit down to a piece of paper with a pencil. That's the only tool you need is your pencil. So in terms of who should be taking the SAT, I think a lot of students have felt like, oh, the SAT is just going to be easier, and so that's just what I'm going to do, and they don't really think about it. And the logistics of taking it, the technological barriers might mean that you have a much better testing experience with the ACT, or the ACT is much more accessible. So that is something important to keep in mind. If the SAT is being offered at your school and they're providing the device for you, that's a very stress-free way to go about it. If those two circumstances are not the case, you may want to think it through. So I typically recommend students who are strongest in math take the SAT because the math portion is 50% of the score. It's a very hefty chunk that can make or break how well your SAT score turns out. Whereas on the ACT, it's worth quite a bit less. Students who are good in humanities, reading, writing, grammar tend to like the ACT better, or can improve the most on the ACT. They may not like it more because it's still a test, but you can improve the most in your score. If you really like digital tests, if you feel like you can focus more and you like that it reminds you to go back to a question, then by all means, like, favor a digital platform test. But if you really hate digital platforms and you prefer, like, it hurts your eyes, or you could just focus better on paper, you like that you have more control on paper, whatever it may be, um, you know, you have no options with the SAT, whereas you do with the ACT. And then lastly, for the SAT, it's really great for students who have really high comprehension, but are maybe slower test takers. So you can get the questions right, but you need more time per question. The SAT does offer that to you, which is what the ACT is trying to compete with some updates that they're making, which we will tell you about when we know more. So yeah, I think the SAT can be a great option, but I think just bear in mind that it's not the only option, and it's not necessarily the best option for everybody. So be smart. Yeah.
And that's all for today. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If you'd like to contact Julia or myself directly, you can send admissions questions to me at info@mymarchconsulting.com and testing questions to Julia at hello@higherscorestestprep.com. Those will be linked in the show notes, so you can grab them there as well. For a free college planning consultation, you can go to mymarchconsulting.com higherscorestestprep.com/services and check out higherscorestestprep.com to take our SAT versus ACT quiz, or maybe download our free guides to the SAT or ACT, or sign up for a test prep course because you know you're going to need it. This has been the College Checklist Podcast with Julia and Christina. See you next time, and thanks for listening.
Happy testing.